Welcome. My name is Forrest Longman. I'm the president of the City Club Board of Directors. The mission of City Club is to inform, connect, and engage our community to strengthen the civic health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. We begin, as always, by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people, and it has been this way since time immemorial. I'd like to thank all the volunteers who made our program possible. I'd especially like to thank KMRE radio board member Robert Clark, who is producing today's program, and BTV10, who will broadcast it to their viewers. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for their support. They are Bruce and Claudia Dysand, Danny Neal, real estate broker for the Moyat Group, Firehouse Arts and Events Center, Colshan CPAs, the Opportunity Council, Pacific Continental Realty, Unity Care Northwest, Village Books, Western Washington University, Whatcom Community College, and the Whatcom Community Foundation. Our April program will feature the new director of Bellingham Whatcom County Tourism. He will discuss the economic impact of tourism on Whatcom County. And now I will hand things off to today's moderator, Jane Bright. Jane is the new chair of our program committee and will introduce today's speaker. Jane?
Thank you, Forrest. And today's topic of China could not be more timely. And we're just thrilled to have Dr. Kristen Parris join us today. And Dr. Parris earned her master's in East Asian Studies and her PhD in political science from Indiana University. She joined the political science department at Western Washington University in 1991. Dr. Parris's research interests includes Chinese politics, nationalism, identity and ideology, civil society, community governments, authoritarianism, citizenship, and state building. She has traveled extensively and conducted research in China and is a member of the Western Center for East Asian Studies, an interdisciplinary program that draws upon the expertise of more than 20 faculty from across the university. She speaks and reads Mandarin Chinese. Professor Parris teaches courses on modern government and politics, East Asian politics, international relations of East Asia, you have to say this one, Kristen, Chinese politics, citizenship, and nationalism in U.S.-China relations. As part of the Western faculty-led study abroad programs, Professor Parris has taken groups of students to China to study Chinese culture, community, and citizenship. She is also past president of the Association of Asian Studies of the Pacific Coast. And we are thrilled to have you and welcome to the City Club.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm always happy to talk about China. And it seems like a thing that a lot of people are thinking and talking about. So today, I actually have prepared a lot of material, and I'm afraid probably too much. So, we can try and focus on what people are interested in. I've, put together some slides that look at sort of where China is and where U.S.-China relations are and how we got here. And so just briefly, like an overview, I'll be looking at, U.S. and we'll introduce with some maps and then think about the nature of the Chinese system, because I think that Chinese domestic system is really important to understand, and perhaps many Americans don't necessarily know how that works. So if you want to understand, international relations and Chinese foreign policy and U.S.-China relations, then we have to have some idea about that. So we'll look at that, and then move on to some overview of China's foreign policy development and some flashpoints in U.S.-China relations, including Taiwan, which is probably the most significant, important, and most likely to lead us into some serious conflict if we're not careful. So I want to start by saying that I first went to China in the 1980s. So I've seen China change a lot And in 1987, I was riding my bicycle in Hangzhou, which is a city in eastern China. It's a provincial capital. It's an ancient capital of China. It is a very lovely tourist city, and one that's really grown exponentially as much of China has. At that point in time in 1987, as I was riding my old sort of Raleigh knockoff along beside the lake, some young man rode up next to me, and in English he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from America." And he just said, "America is a good country." And I just thought to myself at that moment, gosh, where can an American travel where that would happen? And I was very amused, and we had a little chat as we rode along. And I want to say that things are very different now. And I don't really get that response anymore. Actually, I haven't been back to China since pre-COVID, but I hope to go back sometime in the fall, I think. Okay, so let's start, and I think I'll do a screen share. Yeah, so first I have some maps. So here's China, right, in East Asia. So this map says it's East Asia. It includes much of Asia. And we see China is a huge country that is not surprising, might dominate the region. Of course, what's not in this is like what's over here on the other side of this Pacific Ocean, sort of the other side of the Pacific Rim, which would include the United States, which has long been the dominant power in East Asia. And that what we're seeing right now is a perhaps not surprising increasing competition between China and the United States. So this is a map. I just thought I'd put the map of China out there. It has the different provinces. So China has 22 or 23 provinces, depending on who you are and how you're counting. I will count Taiwan in this. It is a disputed territory. There are so 23 provinces, 5 autonomous regions, which are these darker yellow colors. And these are areas that had a significant population of ethnicities that were different from the dominant ethnicity of China, which is the Han. So these include famously Xinjiang and Tibet, as well as Inner Mongolia and Guangxi, and also Ningxia here. You'll notice they are mostly along the borders, and they are therefore represent potentially significant areas for Chinese security. China is surrounded by 14 different countries, something that the United States never has to think much about, since we're just not really surrounded at all, but we have 2 friendly countries on either side on our borders, plus 2 oceans. China has many countries. And I think that it's important to note that China is a huge continental-based country that has had considerable conflict along its borders over time. Another map, this just shows you, compares China and the United States. They're almost the same size, depending on whether you're measuring just land or you're including water. I just say effectively they're the same size. And they also, are about the same in terms of latitudes. So you can see, the very northwest where Harbin is, Shanghai in eastern China. Here's Beijing. And so Shanghai and Washington, D.C. are about the same, although Shanghai is the commercial capital. Beijing is still, of course, the political capital. I just wanted to show you this slide because this is the Empire of the Great Qing, which was the last dynasty in China. And you can see that at that time, China reached its biggest in terms of area or territory. It included all of Mongolia because, of course, there was the Mongol Empire, and Manchuria because, of course, the Qing dynasty was in fact a Manchu dynasty, which had come down from the north over to Tibet and to Xinjiang. Xinjiang, which is this territory in China's most northwest area, Xinjiang means new border region. And so it is the area that was incorporated most recently by the Qing dynasty, and of course claimed by China. China doesn't claim all of the Qing dynasty. Of course, Mongolia is an independent country, for example. Okay. And I will also note that China, this is a very important element of China's current identity, and that is that China experienced imperialism, both Western imperialism and Japanese imperialism. So this is a map that shows spheres of influence and the treaty ports in China in 1900. So basically from the mid 19th century until 1949, when the PRC was established, China faced fragmentation under competing warlords and also Western and Japanese imperialism, which sought to divide China up and take control of its customs and its major ports, and then along the rivers as well. And then I just showed this one. Recently, we've heard this complaint from Xi Jinping that China faces American encirclement and containment. And so as China looks around, they see a history of US dominance in Asia. And this is a map that shows US forward defense ring and US bases and allies and semi-allies along this semicircle that is encircling China. So so it's not surprising then that we see Xi Jinping reaching out to Russia, that at this point in time, Xi Jinping is happy to have a friend in Russia. And of course, Putin is happy to have Xi Jinping and China as a friend and supporter, whatever that might mean. I'll also just note that I sort of alluded to it already, that China has many ethnic groups. And I'm not sure this is something that most Americans are aware of, but it's worth noting that there are officially 56 ethnic groups. That includes the dominant group, the Han. And I would say that the Han are kind of like, I'm sure there are many anthropologists that will not be happy with this comparison, but I would say that the Han are in many ways like white people in America, that the Han themselves really are made up of a lot of different peoples that spoke different languages, ate different cuisines, had different local cultures, but over time sort of became the Han. And that's over 92% of the population now identify as Han. And then there are 55 other ethnic groups that include, of course, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the Tibetans in Tibet, Mongols in Inner Mongolia and elsewhere, and many others. There are also many language groups, and as part of this assimilation into Hanness, the dominant language is now Mandarin, but in fact, there are many local languages. And these local languages, especially as you move to the south, are sometimes mutually incomprehensible. So that if you were from Beijing, or you wouldn't be able to understand Shanghainese, although you might pick it up fairly quickly, or certainly not Guangdonghua or Cantonese. And there are many different languages all along here. Indeed, if you move where I was living here in Hangzhou, if you went from Hangzhou to Wenzhou down here in the southeastern tip of Zhejiang province, you would find that in Wenzhou, they spoke a completely different dialect that was mutually incomprehensible. People from Hangzhou couldn't understand this dialect here. And there was a time when Wenzhou language was understood only by people in like a 50-mile radius of that city itself. So there's great variation and diversity in China. And then, of course, we know that China has had this rip-roaring economy. And so that, especially beginning in the 1980s, China's economy, its GDP growth, this is real growth, increased in an impressive way into the 2000s. And then, of course, it began to slow. The growth has begun to slow in recent years, especially in the face of COVID, but even before that. This is a projection into a little bit into the future that shows China and the United States. So China's has a huge economy, but the United States still has a bigger economy, depending on how you measure this. But in any case, in terms of GDP per capita, the United States is still far richer than China. And that means different things, especially when we consider the amount of inequality in both countries. But we have GDP per capita in the United States, which is significantly higher than it is in China. Something to consider when we think about Chinese wealth. It's a big economy, but there are also a lot of people. Okay, so I don't want to, and I'll also note just that the United States has a huge military budget and spends more on its military than really anybody by far. So China's had a growing military and been spending a lot on its military, but still the United States is way ahead in defense spending, which does not necessarily mean that the United States could beat China in a war. It just means that we have we spend a lot of money on the military. I wanted to just compare to this, just some basic data so that we can see in terms of land area. I'm sorry, this is kilometers square. By this determination, China is bigger, but basically the same size. Population, though, of course, is the United States is much smaller in terms of its population and therefore its population density. Chinese people also mostly live in the eastern part of China. We can see the GDP per capita. So this is this is 2019. So it would be bigger for both countries, but still about proportionate. And we can see the GDP per capita. And also, I think it's interesting to look at life expectancy. In many ways, we could argue, well, a question might be, is the PRC kind of sort of hitting above its weight a little bit, or is the United States sort of being below its weight? And I think in some ways, maybe both are true. The United States should be able to do better in life expectancy. Its major allies in East Asia all have much longer lived. And infant mortality is better in East Asian allies as well. Literacy rates are high in China as they are in the United States, and Chinese is actually much harder to learn to read than English is. In terms of civil rights, civil liberties, and democracy, not surprisingly, China is considered a not free country by the Freedom House Index, and the United States is considered a free country, a democratic country, in spite of some problems and some decline in recent years, according to Freedom House, which is an NGO. And then I want to just highlight the inequality. There is a significant degree of inequality in both China and the United States. And I saw a most recent number, which is this Gini coefficient. The bigger the number, the bigger the gap in wealth. And the smaller the number, the smaller the gap in wealth. So China and the United States both have considerable inequalities, especially when compared with East Asian allies. And of the United States, China's is really significantly high and higher than, say, Taiwan, for example. Also, China has basically it runs in the middle of the pack in terms of corruption, according to the so-called Corruption Perceptions Index, which is run by NGO Transparency International. And they try to rank countries according to the perceptions of corruption, because people don't just say, hey, hi, I'm corrupt when you survey them. So they interview lots of different people and have their own methodology, which you can visit and understand to rank countries around the world in terms of corruption. And I think that we often think of China as very corrupt, and there are problems with corruption. Xi Jinping had a major anti-corruption campaign, which really did take care of some of it. And again, in the world, it's like about in the middle of the pack in terms of corruption. And we could look at, if we wanted to, the East Asian allies of the United States, as well as North Korea, which is an ally of China. But I think that I'll just leave that off for now. Seems like that's a lot of slides. So question is, how is it we've gotten to this place where we have, at the very least, considerable competition and a sense that there's a real rivalry between China and the United States. And there are those who would argue, well, this is to be expected, and it is indeed unavoidable. Because, for example, the scholar John Mearsheimer, who's a so-called realist in international relations, he would argue that when you have two countries that have the kind of resources and population and land mass, as you do with the United States and China, they are almost necessarily going to come into competition with each other, and that tension is inevitable and conflict is also potentially inevitable. So that the United States, as a kind of hegemonic power, dominant power in the world, will necessarily see an up and coming state like China, which is emerging and rising in a way that is perhaps challenging, even if it doesn't mean to challenge. It's just structurally, the international system is such that the dominant power will see the emerging power as a threat. And so the potential for rivalry and conflict is really significant under those conditions. Now, is it inevitable? I would say certainly not, but it does need to be well managed.
Kristen, can I interrupt with a question about that?
Please.
I have been seeing more journalists use the term New World Order as something that China is seeking. Can you comment on that and what that might mean?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty interesting question, I think, because there is a lot of a consideration on the part of some Chinese scholars as well as policymakers, and about the creation of an international system and an interstate system that reflects Chinese, oftentimes they will say East Asian values rather than Western values, and that the time has come to create a system, at least in East Asia, that is reflective of the local culture and the local ways of doing things. So in China, this tends to, I think, harken back to I suppose we could say that, an old and ancient Chinese, I'm sorry, I don't actually have a slide for this, I should, Chinese, a Sino-centric interstate system. So if we look back to ancient China, even, maybe to when China was at its height during the Tang Dynasty, say, I don't know, 800 or something, but and before that and well after, we have a China-centric system that was an interstate system in which that was hierarchical, with China at the center and the surrounding states as tributary states who, at the very least, paid lip service to China's dominance and visited China on diplomatic missions where they kowtowed to the Chinese emperor and brought tribute. So I think that there is a vision of a region and perhaps a world in which China is the central power, and that it is governing based on these East Asian values, which are East Asian values of harmony and order rather than conflict and competition. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I don't know. It's hard to make sense of a lot of what's going on today, but one of the questions we have is the situation with Russia and Ukraine, and it seems as though the situation in Ukraine is driving China and Russia closer. Could you comment on that too, and how the dynamics are working out there?
Yeah, actually, that was something that I hope to talk about, and I can just basically talk a little bit about that now. We all know that just in the past few days, Xi Jinping went to Russia to consult with Putin. So that will be his 40th time to have visited visited Russia to meet with Putin. And I think that what to say about that? I think that Xi Jinping certainly sees this as a good thing for China because they share a very long border, and it's a border that they've actually had like shooting across in the 1960s, which was the basis for, the sort of the Nixon Shanghai communique and all of that, and the beginning of normal relations with the United States. It is also so it's good in that way for China, and it's also part of China's effort to demonstrate that it is it's a global power, and it's a normal country that will establish normal relations with other countries and engage them. So China does. What this means for Ukraine is, who knows? I don't really know what they talked about. I think that China is being very careful with its, in terms of Ukraine. It doesn't want to be a pariah state, but it also doesn't want to take sides. And I think that China has offered to mediate. And interestingly, Zelensky has actually made an overture, a minor maybe overture to China, which we could think about what that would be. But and many people are very cynical about that. And I think it's important to be skeptical, but I also wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. I think that war, the question of where that war is going is not my area of expertise, but it's one. I think that thinking about ways to move towards some kind of peace would be, or at least stopping the shooting would be a very good thing. I wanted to say first, what is China? And I think that that's when we think about Xi Jinping having 40 different visits to, meetings with Putin. That's a lot. He hasn't come close to meeting anyone else that many times, especially Biden, but really anybody. I think that we can say that China politically is a Leninist party system. And that means this is the thread through PRC history, that China was founded as a Leninist party state, as a Marxist-Leninist party state, and it continues to be a Leninist party state. The Marxist part of it is still in the rhetoric, but that's much less important, I would say, than the Leninist part of it. And what does that mean? I'll just say that it means there is a single monopoly party that controls all political organization and seeks to shape and manage all social organization, that the party and the government with its associated agencies of the state are interlocking at every level, so that the party parallels the government and its associated agencies, and it interlocks. And that means that the leaders of the party at every level, from the center to the provincial to the local, are also the leaders in the government, and the party oversees the operation of the government, and that has been tighter and looser since 1980, and it's tighter now under Xi Jinping. The party takes a leading role in all organization, in leading the government, and also the economy. And then finally, I'll just mention a Leninist term, democratic centralism. And this is the idea that while there may be some opportunity for party members to contribute in discussion and debate, once a party makes a decision, all of the levels, every single party member and everyone else will be disciplined in accepting and implementing the decisions of the party center. And so this is I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to show, this is the interlocking, this is a picture of the interlocking party state, where you have Xi Jinping as the general secretary. And note over here, he's also the head of state. His power comes from his being the general secretary. So the fact that we call Xi Jinping President Xi is kind of deceptive. Really what he is General Secretary Xi, who has this symbolic position as president because he is the general secretary. There's the Politburo Standing Committee that has 7 members, and that's the apex of, he's the apex of power. And these 7 members work closely with Xi Jinping. Then there's the Politburo with 24 members, still very small, the Central Committee, and then the National Party Congress. And there are about 96,000 members of the party, which is pretty small given how many Chinese people there are. And then you have the governing and state agency. So there is, this is like where you have a premier, which is Li Chang right now, and then you have a sort of a cabinet of ministers, the state council, and the bureaucracy. You also have the legislature, the National People's Congress, and you have a judiciary, which is the Supreme People's Court, and this is like a DA's office, and at every level from the center to the province to the municipalities and down, you have the 3 branches of government that are paralleled at every level by the party, down to the lowest work unit where party members all have their party life. Okay, so, and then I'll just give you a picture of the General Secretary, Xi Jinping, and his new Politburo Standing Committee, which includes these folks, right? And it's no longer some idea of collective leadership, which is what was established under Deng Xiaoping as the ideal in China, where they tried to avoid having somebody like Mao emerge again. Instead, Xi Jinping likes the idea of being not just the first among equals, but really the first. And then his apparently handpicked members of the Standing Committee, and they each have their own sort of portfolio. So yeah, so I guess I'll just stop and ask if there are questions. I'm going to just briefly note the nature of the economic system, or sort of the political economic system. But if anybody had questions just on that, and I'm sorry if this is review. My experience is that people don't really know much about the workings of the political economy of China, and I just wanted to give that just put that out there so people have a sense. Questions that seem like maybe we should talk about them?
One of the questions that has come up, and I don't know if you can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Is, as controlling as China is viewed to be, it was rather surprising to a lot of people that after what felt like a few protests over COVID restrictions after 3 years, the government did a total about face. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, I have no idea why that happened, I have to say, but it's quite interesting, and we can speculate why that happened. But so I want to say just a couple of things maybe in response to that. China is a highly authoritarian, autocratic country. Its system, as we saw, is highly centralized in many ways, and more centralized under Xi Jinping than it has been in a long time. Although I would say we can overdo that, and people sort of live their lives in an everyday way without thinking necessarily a lot about the political system. So it's not like people are just burdened every moment of every day thinking about, Big Brother looking over their shoulder. Why Xi Jinping changed his mind about the COVID lockdown that had gone on? I mean, I think that, I don't know. I'll just say this. I don't know why it happened, but I will say that it's pretty clear that they were up against they were between a rock and a hard place as far as how to end the lockdown, because it's very clear that this variant was not as dangerous as the earlier variants of COVID, but also it was very contagious. So that it was like, what was the end game? So it's one of these situations in which, I'm not really sure if they thought about, or even how they might have known how it would unfold. So they just let it loose, because I think in the face of these protests in Shanghai, they decided, and perhaps having experienced the kind of uproar that they had in Hong Kong, And I think that we saw protests in Shanghai, but there were certainly protests going on elsewhere. And we know that there were in Xinjiang. And not only were there protests in Xinjiang, there was considerable sympathy in Shanghai and elsewhere for these people that died in a fire in Xinjiang. Those people were Uyghurs, which is a minority that has been subject to considerable suppression on the part of the party. And I think the last thing that China wants is to have any kind of horizontal connections happening between ordinary folks, especially young people in Shanghai, and ethnic groups in Xinjiang. So, perhaps they just decided, you know what, let's just let this go. And so they did. And then everybody got COVID. I mean, I don't have a ton of friends in China, but I do have friends that I talk with regularly. And there was not a one of them that didn't get sick. And then mostly all recover, not everybody. So I don't know if that, is at least a little bit of a response to that. Just note that we can think about China as a kind of China Inc. And I have a Time magazine cover here that actually shows Japan. I do, in fact, know the difference between China and Japan. But I put this up here because China, I would argue that China was following on purpose. Like, it's not that they had a blueprint for their reforms and changes since the Maoist period, but they certainly seem to be following a trajectory that looked a lot like the capitalist development states that Japan sort of pioneered, beginning really in the 19th century with the Meiji Restoration, and then again more democratically in the 20s, and then in the post-war period. But also, I think even more similar would be South Korea, which was highly authoritarian when they began this capitalist development state. And so it is different than the Soviet type system or the old Maoist command economy, but it's also not an American style or sort of Anglo-American style of a liberal regulatory state, because it is goal rational with a kind of plan. The plan is a kind of industrial policy, and that industrial policy is led by the National Reform and Development Commission in China, as it was led by the MITI in Japan. It is ideological in the sense that they call it Marxism-Leninism, but Leninism is an organizational principle that that the party has a leading role. The ideology is as much nationalism and developmentalism as almost as anything else. There is the plan. It's not the central command plan, but there is a pilot agency that targets sectors for growth and also rewards for export success. A close relationship between the state and business, redistribution, some welfare programs. It's not the sort of Norwegian model of a welfare state, but some redistribution to maintain stability. And then it is politically authoritarian with a dominant party system or a hegemonic party system, and a kind of a weak or prostrate civil society, which is sort of that associational life is very much circumscribed in these types of systems, more in some than others. So we could call this China Inc., with this close relationship between business and the state, with the state is sort of almost like and for China, we call it the party state, as almost like the chairman of the board. That may be too extreme. I think under Xi Jinping, we have some changes. And a very interesting scholar named Barry Naughton has argued that what we see under Xi Jinping is a move from China Inc. to something called CCP Inc. CCP meaning the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party has come, sort of much more centralized and much more expansive in its relationship to business and in the relationship to the economy and guiding that economy. And a sort of a blurring between private and public sectors in China that we really much more so than we'd seen before. Okay, so I have this sort of overview of foreign policy strategies. And one way to think about China is to look back at the period when Deng Xiaoping came to power, and he initiated economic reforms that were known as reform and opening, 改革开放, and that somehow those were the good old days. I sometimes see those as the good old days, and that somehow we've how did we get here to Xi Jinping, where we have a much more assertive or aggressive China. Some people would argue, well, it's really not necessarily that big of it's a big change, but not really a shift. The change is that China is more powerful, has been economically, its development program has been very successful. And so that if we look back at Deng Xiaoping's idea of cautious engagement, it was, this is his language, his slogans: observe calmly, stand firmly, respond carefully. And then this famous statement: hide our capacities, bide our time, remain free of ambition, never claim leadership. So that sort of bide our time, if we look at Xi Jinping, he may very well have said, yeah, we bided our time, and now it's time for us to step forward because we have stood up, we have grown rich, we have grown strong, and now it's time for us to pursue our national interests in the region and beyond, in this under this rubric, Xi Jinping's rubric of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and creating a global system that is based on Chinese ideas of harmony. That's the language. Okay, and in between that, we have these leaders: Jiang Zemin for 2 terms, Hu Jintao also for 2 terms, who sort of slowly and quietly expanded China's development domestically, and then also began to move more in terms of sort of going out, and until we get to Xi Jinping, who really consolidates his power domestically, sort of securitizes both domestic and global policies, and seeks to have to be a great power. I mean, doesn't seek to be a great power, asserts that China is a great power and needs to be treated equally as an equal state to the United States and any of its allies.
Kristen, can I interrupt with a question on that? Speaking of foreign policy and economics, it's our understanding that China owns a great deal of US debt. What are the implications of that? And, also the whole, we seem to be codependent, if you will, on trade. How is that playing out? If China called in the debt, what would that mean? And are they apt to do that? I mean, they've been really reaching out to other countries, but we are very intertwined with the US.
Right. And so that's why sometimes people talk about this as a Cold War. And I guess I want to say, I don't think it's a Cold War yet. I have a brother-in-law who insists that we're already on a Cold War and the United States is, the bad guy. And I wouldn't say the United States is the bad guy. And I don't think we're in a Cold War, in part because, I just don't think it's that rivalrous yet, but also because never before, that sort of sounds like the old US-Soviet relationship. And this is not the US-Soviet relationship. We have such deeply intertwined economic system, economic relations. And there is, however, a movement towards what we might call decoupling, and that's occurred really, of course, with Trump and the trade war, and some of what we see in terms of a decline in U.S.-China economic relations is the result of the pandemic, but it's also a concerted effort on the part of both sides to if not fully decouple, to at the very least diversify. So what I was going to do is talk about some flashpoints. And one of the flashpoints is, of course, trade. And so we could say, I mean, and this is the thing that Trump really focused on, right? He focused on this trade imbalance. Now, the fact is that a bilateral trade imbalance, and I am no economist, I'm just going to tell you right now that I'm not, but I know this, that a bilateral trade imbalance is not the point. that we have, and trade imbalances generally aren't the point. But Trump was very concerned about this, and he saw the United States, interestingly, as having been, is like aggrieved, right? And the system rigged against the United States, even though the United States actually built the international system and then coaxed China into it until, China has now sort of started to resist that. But what we can see, some of you may have seen this, that the US-China merchandise trade climbed to a record in 2022. So it looked like to a lot of people, well, neither the pandemic nor the Trump tariffs really matter, but this is just because of inflation. In fact, we do see, so these graphs show that that starting with Trump's trade war, we do see a falling off of trade. And there was an effort to negotiate a settlement that involved China agreeing to just buy a lot of American stuff, which was really interesting. I mean, that was never going to, you just can't force people to buy stuff. So this is what they committed to, but didn't do. And then we could rail against them if we want, or we could think, well, that doesn't really make sense. But in any case, these were the projected purchases if there had been no trade war. This is actually where we are. Here's another one. This is manufactured goods. I just thought I'd show semiconductors and semiconductor equipment. This is something that the United States has control of. We don't manufacture them here, but we have control of that market. And so we've kind of we've stepped in with Biden, right, to have export controls. Here's other manufacturing. So we have some increase, but a lot of that is reflecting inflation. I guess, yeah. So we could move on to Taiwan. I could spend more time on trade. What do you want to do?
Let's talk about Taiwan, because that's where we're getting the most questions.
Okay, so here's Taiwan. And Taiwan is a real head scratcher. What is to be done, right? To quote Lenin, or to ask Lenin's question. So here's Taiwan. It's an island. It's one of many disputed territories in the East and South China Seas. Here it is again. And Taiwan also occupies these islands along here, Matsu, Jinmen, and other lesser islands along here. Taiwan is in control of them, interestingly. There have been some serious incidents of, firing and near war, but Taiwan, as most everybody knows, I think, was claimed by China. China claims they always controlled Taiwan. Until the Sino-Japanese War, when Taiwan was lost to Japan in a settlement as part of losing the war. And that was from the late 19th century until Japan lost World War II, when Taiwan then went back to China, but China was at war with itself. So there was a civil war, but it went back to the nationalist government, which eventually came to dominate and control Taiwan in 1949, when it fled the mainland and went to Taiwan and controlled the island. There are key documents that in some sense govern this sort of triangular relationship between China. I'm calling Taiwan here officially the Republic of China. That's what it's called, and the United States. So originally there was this mutual defense treaty, which was abrogated when Nixon went to China and signed the Shanghai Communique, that ultimately and more slowly than China would have liked, resulted in normalization under Carter. The Congress responded to that, interestingly, with the Taiwan Relations Act, which basically the normalization and the Shanghai Communication both have language that makes it clear that China expects that the United States will stop arming Taiwan as soon as Taiwan Strait is stable, and expects that Taiwan will indeed return to PRC sovereignty. Of course, that's not what Congress had in mind. And so Congress responded with the Taiwan Relations Act, which said that the United States can and will provide arms where necessary and appropriate. And that was further emphasized under Reagan with the so-called 1982 communique. So there are these documents which govern that relationship. I'll come back to that later. I will say that while Taiwan's, when Taiwan's status was being negotiated, it was a highly authoritarian one-party state, which also had a Leninist party state. It's just that it wasn't Marxist. So, so I think that I'll just put up here, we can see the leadership of Taiwan. And over this period of time, especially from the late 80s into the 2000s, Taiwan democratized. It actually is a really interesting and somehow like almost endearing example of modernization theory at work. So it emerges highly authoritarian, also economically kind of a basket case. It then proceeds to develop to become increasingly affluent, and then to democratize. So that at this point, it is a multi-party with two main parties, democracy, and has an alternating parties in power. It is also a wealthy country, and according to the Freedom House, it is one of the most democratic countries in the world. So the current president is Tsai Ing-wen, right here, a woman president who is sort of from the Democratic Progressive Party, which in the past had promoted independence, much to Beijing's chagrin. But I think the fact that Taiwan is democratic and liberal and politically liberal makes it that much harder for us to imagine, the loss of I don't know, I guess we call it the loss of Taiwan, but Taiwan sort of falling under PRC sovereignty again, what that would look like. And the idea of China's, under Deng Xiaoping, they came up with this one country, two systems, which was supposed to be how Hong Kong returned to Chinese sovereignty. And then it was a model for Taiwan. But of course, we know that that basic agreement was abrogated by the Chinese when they put down the student or the democracy movement so harshly in Hong Kong. And so basically, we're at a standoff. So what kinds of questions do people have about Taiwan?
One of the questions, was that directed to me, or was that a rhetorical question?
No, not at all. Please, it's not rhetorical.
Okay. This four-star Air Force General, Mike Minahan, recently said that he expects to be at war with China, have the U.S. at war with China over Taiwan in 2 years. What do you make of that?
I'm horrified. I find it, I think it's just horrifying that anybody would say it's absolutely irresponsible. There is no reason for China and the United States to go to war, and every reason to avoid it. I have no, and not only that, there's no guarantees that the United States could win such a war. So why engage in a war that you don't know if you can win? The United States often thinks it can win war, and it doesn't. But China is a very mighty opponent. And they don't have to take control of the island per se. They can just blockade it. And they can do that really easily. And they can do that tomorrow. They're not going to do it tomorrow. But, and then what are we going to do about that? Go to war, I suppose. But I don't know. I just think it's really irresponsible. And I don't think anyone in the Biden administration would think that's the way to go. And even in spite of Biden's, I would say, I don't even know what to say about Biden's repeated, statements that we will protect Taiwan. I don't know why he says those things, because our policy with regard to Taiwan has been one of strategic ambiguity, which means that nobody knows what we might do. I don't know what we might do, but Biden has been saying we will. But at the same time, we will defend Taiwan. At the same time, there's been no change. Those kinds of statements really rile Beijing. So I would say that.
And what about the U.S. Congress position on China? We hear things all over the map on that, and some very hawkish things as well.
I think that's also unfortunate, because I don't think it helps anything. And I think it's really a sad situation in the United States that the only thing the two parties can agree on is that we hate China, and that there's just 100 things to hate about China. And there's long been a long list of things that America can hate about China. But I think that's, and I guess I don't know why I should have to, but I guess I should put right out there. it's not like I'm in love with the Chinese Communist Party regime. I'm not. But I think that we also, I agree with China that China needs to be treated as an equal in the international political economy. So in any case, I don't think it's helpful at all. And I think it is purely for domestic audience. And what's interesting about this, and what I think everyone should recognize and understand, is that we're mirrors, right, to each other. So that just as no public official or candidate wants to be seen as soft on China in the United States, nobody in China, no leader wants to ever be seen as soft on America. And this is a very unfortunate thing. And it's one of the ways in which we wind up in these sort of tit for tat, sort of spiraling kinds of competitions that turn into rivalry. So I think that it's too bad. And I think it really just speaks to a lack of imagination in the United States on the part of our leadership, that, that the policymakers can't think of something else to be getting together on.
Yeah. What do you think the future of Taiwan is?
Yeah, well, I will say that, and I referenced him before, John Mearsheimer, who is a very well-known scholar of international relations. He some years ago said, first of all, we're going to go to war with China, or not necessarily we're going to go to war, but that is in the offing if we're not careful, which I don't necessarily agree with. I mean, I think that I don't necessarily agree with that particular approach. But he also said, we just need to forget Taiwan, that we have no real interest in going to war over Taiwan, and in fact, no real interest in Taiwan. Now, I think that is something that's debatable, that some people would argue that the waters in the East China Sea and South China Sea are critical to the sort of an American ideal of freedom of the seas. And I think that it's possible that we can negotiate with China to keep the sea lanes open, but some people don't necessarily think so. So what's the future of Taiwan? I think that the more provocative leaders are, the less good the outcome will be. And I will point to Nancy Pelosi on this. Just to full disclosure, I find Nancy Pelosi a very impressive person in many ways, but I think her trip to Taiwan was utterly inexcusable. It just provokes Beijing. And I'm sure that I would be seen as somebody who is, a panda hugger or, cowering before Beijing. I just think there's no reason to be provocative. Why would we? And I do think that the fact is that America's official position is the relationship between Taiwan and China is for the Chinese people on both sides of the straits to work through. I'm not terribly optimistic how that will go, because I don't see China as democratizing anytime soon. But I just think the longer we can hold off conflict, the better. I want to point out one of the things on Taiwan is that as time has passed, on Taiwan, the majority of people in Taiwan see themselves as Taiwanese. And I actually have a slide on that I could show that, they've been doing, polling and surveys and asking people, do you feel that you're Chinese? Do you feel that you're Taiwanese? Do you identify as Taiwanese, as both? And what we see is people identifying as Chinese has fallen off completely. People that identify as both was actually fairly high, and that's really in decline. And we see people identifying as Taiwanese just really taking off. And so it's truly a puzzle.
Yeah. What about the economic ties? I understand that chip making in Taiwan is big, and we're very dependent on that. What are the economic implications for the U.S. with Taiwan?
Well, I think that actually the economic relationships are quite interesting in that Taiwan and the mainland are integrated. That in fact, Taiwan is highly dependent on the mainland as a market, that it exports a huge amount to the mainland. Taiwan is, of course, a part of the product chain for production of semiconductor chips, and that's critical. The United States could produce its own, I don't know. It just feels very uncomfortable to write Taiwan off and produce our own chips. But I'm not sure that itself is the reason for getting into a war over Taiwan. It is a reason for the United States to have contingency plans and perhaps to produce more. I mean, we sort of offshored those in the 1970s, and perhaps it is time to bring a lot of that back to the United States, just for no other reason, for supply chain reasons.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about China and North Korea?
Oh, yeah. I don't actually have any slides on that, but I think that this is a really interesting dynamic that we're seeing right now with China. Not long ago, China was on the same page in many ways with the United States, in that nobody wanted to see North Korea get nuclear weapons, and everybody, and this included Russia, as well as South Korea, Japan, of course, the US, the UN, everybody wanted to see denuclearization. From China's perspective, it just is destabilizing, and just leads to South Korea and Japan sort of bolstering their own defense systems and in ways that destabilizes China and makes their own defenses to be, maybe in some ways antiquated. So, for example, the United States located a THAAD missile defense system in Korea against China's wishes, because China sees this anti-missile system, the THAAD system, as targeting China and making its own sort of nuclear strike capacities irrelevant. Of course, the United States has always said it's not, but China doesn't believe that, and Russia as well. Partly as a result of that, but not just. Also as a part of just this increasing competition and rivalry, China, I think, now has moved to a perspective where, hey, it's all right. First of all, maybe they think, and I actually think it's impossible to walk back the nuclear weapons program in North Korea. But furthermore, from China's perspective, this is a great distraction for the United States and Japan and South Korea. And actually, I'm sure that China thinks the Ukraine is a great distraction, to the extent that the United States and the NATO are putting all of their military might and spending into fighting Russia. That's just that much less that China has to worry about them. In terms of North Korea, a couple of things. One is the United States has two major allies, South Korea and Japan. But China thinks, I believe, and might think, that South Korea is maybe a little bit wobbly, because South Korea may think, and has reason sometimes to think, that the United States support is tenuous, that they are, second or third best in terms of being an ally. And will they really come? And are people, Americans, really committed to rescuing South Korea? Perhaps not. And so that China may be able, one, to woo South Korea away. And then also in terms of Japan will be so worried about North Korea and the Kim family regime's nuclear weapons that they will focus on that and will be less likely to focus on China and to see China as an immediate concern or threat. And because both, certainly Japan, but also to some extent Korea, are committed to Taiwan's defense to some extent, or to at least, they're allied with the United States, that's a relief for China to have them distracted in that way. So I think that we see a shift. So from China really wishing that the Kim regime did not have a nuclear program and was not launching off these nuclear weapons because it was destabilizing, to now saying, well, maybe that's a good distraction. That it's kind of an asset now for us vis-a-vis the United States, South Korea, and Japan.
Okay. Did you have other topics that you wanted to cover before we go into more questions?
Let's see. I could talk a little bit about human rights as a flashpoint. Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know. I guess I think that what's most important is that people get to ask questions that they want to. Basically, people
yeah,
get to
well,
do what
this
they
is
want to
very
do.
much related to that. We have a question about the Uyghurs and why they are treated so poorly. I mean, with 50, what did you say, 55 and 56 ethnic groups, we hear mostly about the Uyghurs, I believe. So can help us understand all that, please?
Okay, we used to hear about the Tibetans all the time. And nobody knew who the Uyghurs were. I used to be, when I would say Uyghur, people were like, what? Never heard of it. Yeah, so the Uyghurs. It's interesting to point out that way back in 2001, after 9/11, Jiang Zemin, who was the party leader and president at the time, was one of the first, if not the first, to come out and declare support for the United States in the face of this attack on the United States by these radical extremist terrorists. And as it didn't take long to figure out that what the Chinese Communist Party saw was an opportunity to get the United States on board with at the very least sympathizing with their own their own concern about their Northwest area, Xinjiang, and what they were calling, and they started to call it that time publicly, a terrorism in that area. So that there had long, as I mentioned, Xinjiang is the newest part of China that was brought in rather later than any other place in China to become part of China under the Manchu dynasty. And there had always been, we could argue, there had always been close relations between China and that area of Central Asia, but there had also always been a desire to establish an independent Turkestan, East Turkestan. And that was true during the revolutionary period. And Mao, from my understanding, from what I've read, had actually promised a faction of Uyghurs that if they fought alongside the communists, that the communists would grant independence, which of course they did not. So there has been a long history of a desire for independence, or at the very least autonomy, to set up a Turkestan, an East Turkestan. The Uyghurs are a Muslim people. They are culturally very distinct from the Han, much more so than many others. In this way, it's more like the Tibetans, who are quite distinct from the Han. And indeed, there were some Uyghurs who were fighting in Afghanistan, or were actually training in Afghanistan and so they were sort of seen by Americans as terrorists, but really their focus was on Beijing. Now I say that I want to, everybody take that with a grain of salt. In fact, what China saw as terrorism in Xinjiang, I would say, is resistance and insurgency. Sometimes, mostly not an insurgency, but not organized really. But so that you have resistance to Beijing's control, and sometimes indeed very tight control of that area. Starting in 2009, there was an incident, or a series of incidents, between Uyghurs and Han that actually started outside of Xinjiang between some workers, and then sort of boomeranged back into Xinjiang, Urumqi, which is the capital, and resulted in some riots, protests, and also some odd resistance behavior, sort of anomic behavior, where some, I guess, Uyghurs were like stabbing people on buses in China with like syringes. Now, none of those people were hurt or harmed, except for they got poked. But it is a little terrifying to be subject to that kind of thing, because nobody knows what it is. So in any case, starting in 2009, there was an effort to really rein in further Xinjiang. which had already, I mean, it's a special autonomous region, which just means it is less autonomous than any other place in China. And they have sort of clamped down more. So I visited Xinjiang in 2009. And at that time, they didn't have any access to the internet at all. It didn't matter. Even if you were Han, you didn't have access to the internet. And there was a trial going on of maybe 5 or 6 Uyghurs who had been engaged in a riot. And they were, of course, convicted. Since that time, there have been occasional acts of resistance and violence, which China has cast as terrorism. And since 2001, was able to get U.S. agreement to identify at least one, I mean, actually one group, the East Turkestan Liberation Organization, I think it's called, as a terrorist organization. That organization has since been taken off that list. But in 2001, I was living in China at the time. It was the first time then that Beijing began to talk about the fact that they had terrorism themselves. And it was in the newspapers, and people were like, oh, we have terrorists too. And this really strong clampdown. And that has only just gotten more and more harsh. And under Xi Jinping is when you have these detention centers, which were called sort of training centers. And no doubt they were getting sort of reform through labor, but it's also clear that there was an effort to reform thinking and to move people away from religious beliefs. And anybody that had any external indication of their Muslim beliefs, like a beard, a headscarf, they were taken unceremoniously into these detention centers and held against their will. So around, they say around 1 million people maybe went through the detention centers.
Are they still doing that?
I think that's ratcheted down somewhat, but I believe it's still in place. But honestly, I'm not actually sure.
So say more about human rights in general in China.
Okay. So this is probably the most egregious example of human rights violations, and I say that because I will say it's a little different than what's happened before in China, because this attack, and I'll call it an attack, I mean, in some ways almost a war on the Uyghurs, is ethnically determined. It is because they are Uyghurs that they are being detained. And so I think in this world, it's one of the cases, I think, of a detention of a people because of their ethnic and religious identities, which is very, very deeply disturbing and not something that we'd seen in China before. China has a history of detaining people for political reasons, but they're political reasons, which doesn't make it okay. And I guess maybe I'll throw it out there for people to think about. Is it worse if it's ethnically based or even racially based? Because Turkic people are actually, I mean, what's the difference between race and ethnicity? Partly there's a physical difference, right? So in any case, there have historically been human rights violations. China in its most, so Xi Jinping in his recent visit with Putin came out with a statement, maybe some of you have read it, in which they say, oh, yes, universal values are great, democracy is great, rights are great, but these have to be determined within every country for itself, and sovereignty shouldn't be violated. China has long had human rights violations. There are no opposition parties. If you attempt to organize a party, you will soon find yourself detained and if not disappeared, imprisoned in ways that are meant to make you stop, but also scare others. I think we could say that civil society organizations, those organizations that operate in what civil society is a sort of sphere of autonomous self-organization, that sphere in China, which was really, I think, blossoming in the 90s and especially in the early 2000s, has seen a real clampdown. And that legally, any social organization must be affiliated with a state agency. And the only kinds of organizations that are really allowed, I would say now, are those organizations which are service organizations. They are offering social services. It's very difficult to organize others. When I was in China in 2017, I actually started going to a meeting of an LGBTQ group, partly because a friend I knew was going regularly, and I was just really curious. And it's just an independent group. They had a support group, met every Wednesday, and they sponsored a little, not marathon, but at a time when the city had a big marathon, they sponsored a small race. And basically, they were just about trying to support each other and then make themselves visible. But beginning maybe in 2020, maybe 2019, that organization also has seen a clampdown. So, and they really weren't political in any significant way. So civil society has been constrained considerably, and even, or maybe among other, we might even say especially, feminist groups. Efforts to create a kind of Me Too movement in China has faced a real strong fist from the Chinese, and we see the so-called Feminist Five were imprisoned, detained because of their feminist organizing around Me Too, which is interesting given that the Chinese Communist Party has presented itself always as a feminist party in which they promote women holding up half the sky. So so in terms of Amnesty International or Freedom House, China ranks very low in terms of its protection of civil liberties and civil rights, even as China claims that it has its own definition of rights, and that Chinese people are thriving under Chinese Communist Party rule when before the Chinese communists came to power, Chinese people faced Western and Japanese imperialism and struggled to be even treated as humans.
Yeah, you started out by commenting about when on your first trip that someone was very pleased to see an American and had a very positive attitude toward Americans. How would you characterize the attitude of the so-called average Chinese person today toward America?
I don't really think I know the average Chinese person, and of course everybody knows there's no such thing. I think that nationalism is really quite strong in China. Chinese people, like Americans, are very nationalistic, very patriotic. Americans, I think, often don't think of themselves as nationalistic, but actually, I think, again, we're sort of mirrors with China. I think that there is considerable skepticism and suspicion of the US government on the part of many people, including quite a number of my friends, and my friends are, for the most part, highly educated. I mean, because my connections with the university, that's who I meet. And I meet others as well, but we might think of intellectuals as the people who are most likely to be sympathetic, but it's not the case. There is a very, very strong, we would call it sort of new left in China that is very nationalistic. So I think that there's a lot of skepticism about the US, not on the part of everyone. Those same people are very skeptical of their own government, of course. Many of them. So I'll say that. I'll even say that actually I have two friends, both men in their early 60s maybe, who have for quite a number of years been determined to leave China. And one is now getting a residence card in Europe. And the other hopes to come to the United States and become a resident here. So both of them highly educated. So I think that, leaving China in your 60s when you're economically perfectly secure, I think that's, speaks to, some people are dissatisfied particularly with Xi Jinping's clamping down. But I think for many Chinese, they don't necessarily, even if they are sometimes unhappy with their own government, they don't necessarily see the United States as their savior. And I think that's, maybe with good reason. And it's also the result of a very strong program of patriotic education that started in the 1990s.
Well, speaking of education, can you tell us a little bit about education there? And also, I don't know if it's still going on, but we used to see many Chinese coming to the U.S. for graduate school and or even undergraduate. And I don't know, my impression is that has leveled off because of the hostility toward Chinese in the U.S. But what's it like there compared to the U.S. and what kind of trade do we have going back and forth with students?
So I actually don't have any data on that right now. It was at one time, the United States was absolutely the first, the first destination of choice for anyone seeking to go abroad. But not everyone, right? But most people, overwhelmingly most people, and certainly for going abroad to study, the United States was seen as having, the preeminent schools of higher education in the world. But of course, that's not so true anymore. And that's partly because the United States has not been as welcoming as it might be. And in some ways that started with Trump, who sought to constrain visas and the numbers of international students that came to the United States, I think really failing to understand what a resource it is. And in the case of the Chinese, I mean, just explicitly saying he viewed every single Chinese student that came to the United States as a spy, which is really outrageous. And unfortunately, it just provokes a kind of anti-Asian attitude in the United States. So, and of course, there were, many people that came to the United States and experienced some of that racism and left because of it. I think that there are still many people that would like to come to the United States. I just talked to a friend who is now visiting. Her son is at Harvard, and she's visiting. So we talked on WeChat or Weixin, and she said she was trying to get information from me about a high school and a boarding situation for a friend, the son of a friend of hers. So, many people still do see the United States as a place to go. And the education system in China is really a kind of examination hell. And there are lots of Chinese students who do not thrive under those conditions. And so for some people, it's like a way to get ahead and learn English. But for some people, it's also, my child cannot succeed in this system. And there are not a lot of good alternatives. And so I'm going to send them to Britain or to the United States or to Canada. And it's been Canada and Britain and Australia more than the US in recent years. But I think the US is still seen as a possible destination. I mean, there's racism and all of those. There's racism in China against the Uyghurs, among others. But the United States has a bad reputation. And the Black Lives Matter movement is something that the Chinese government itself uses as part of its own propaganda. I'll say information campaign, partly disinformation, propaganda, some of which is true, and that's may give some people pause.
Do you want to comment on the, if you will, spying and intellectual property theft the Chinese are, I think, known to have done in
Right.
trade secrets, etc.?
Well, with regard to spying, I'm going to say spy's going to spy. They do. We do. They do. We all do. I don't really pay a lot of attention to it. The balloon brouhaha was just as silly as can be, as far as I am concerned. Unfortunately, it's taken seriously in terms of having actually spies on the ground, moles and what have you. Is taken very seriously by both sides, and more. And the United States has been taking that very seriously in recent years. And the Trump administration started something called the China Initiative, which sought to, really was based on the premise that there were just a lot of spies, and they were in academia, and they were in, various think tanks, and also at different companies in their research, their R&D programs, et cetera. And I think, I don't know what to say. Yes, there is economic espionage, and also people were unfairly targeted and their lives were really upended. And there's also this unfortunate, I mean, for regular people, it's unfortunate that the Chinese Communist Party seeks to turn Chinese expats in the United States or others who are working either as they're students or they've stayed and they're working in the United States. They really do have have sought to turn them into moles, or I don't know, maybe mole is the wrong, maybe that's too really weirdly dramatic, but into people who are providing information. And they sometimes do it a little bit at a time. And they do it through inviting someone to give a talk, something I'm often invited to do. In the past, when you could more easily go to China. And but people who are in tech and information industries especially, and then little by little ask them for more information, just somebody who seems to be their peer, another scholar. And some of those people prevailed upon do provide information. Some of it is, some of it is, protected and some of it isn't. And I'm not really sure what to say about that. I guess I just do not believe that the United States hasn't been engaged in the same thing. We are not as successful in our spying. And some Americans will say, and certainly officially we say, okay, but yeah, spies are going to spy, but we don't do economic espionage. And maybe that's true. I don't know. But my response to that is always, then we need to do better. Because they are going to do it, because it doesn't make sense to just cut off relations, because science and arts and the humanities are all, and technology is all enlivened by the exchange. And so the United States just needs to do better. That's, if you want to call it a competition, do, and then compete. And that's actually, we're good at it. So we should just do that.
Okay. Kristen, we are out of time. I want to thank you so much. I know you put a lot of effort and thought into this, and it's a very, very big topic to cover in a very short amount of time. And on behalf of the Bellingham City Club, I really, really thank you. It's been tremendous. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. It's always so fun to talk about China. I wish we were actually in person where I could talk like a real human being with other real human beings.
We will be in person at some point soon, I do believe. So
thanks so much.
Thank you, Kristen. And thanks for everyone who joined us today.
Thanks for listening.